Most garden waste, never actually becomes living soil. It often turns into compost that appears finished, but, behaves as if it's dead, or even worse, it just rots, smells, and attracts all sorts of problems. The missing link isn't more turning or adding more green material, or even fiddling with better ratios. It's actually fermentation. This step was, once upon a time, common knowledge among growers who simply couldn't afford to lose nutrients or precious time. When fermentation is skipped, valuable energy just escapes into the air. But when it's used correctly, waste transforms into a biologically active material that soil organisms recognize immediately. Why is decomposition alone not enough? Well, decomposition is really just uncontrolled breakdown. Fermentation, on the other hand, is guided transformation. During decomposition, microbes compete in a rather chaotic fashion. Heat spikes, nutrients volatilize, and honestly, much of the original value is simply lost. With fermentation, conditions are set to favour specific organisms that preserve nutrients while converting complex material into simpler, plant-ready forms. Old growers knew that just allowing waste to rot freely was, frankly, inefficient. Fermenting waste first kept nutrients locked in, all while building up microbial strength. So, how does fermentation capture nutrients instead of letting them escape? When plant scraps, weeds and kitchen waste are, just exposed to air, nitrogen escapes as gas and carbon is lost rather quickly. Fermentation limits oxygen and encourages lactic acid bacteria and beneficial yeasts to thrive. These organisms convert sugars into organic acids that stabilize nitrogen and minerals. So instead of losing value, the waste actually becomes more potent. For instance, fermented grass clippings retain far more nitrogen than dried or composted clippings, making them, powerful soil builders once incorporated. Now, let's talk about the role of simple sugars in activating fermentation. Fermentation, you see, really does require fuel. The old methods often relied on naturally sweet plant materials or just small amounts of natural sugars. Things like molasses, overripe fruit, or even crushed grains were added to, kickstart microbial activity. These sugars feed the beneficial microbes quickly, allowing them to dominate before harmful organisms can take hold. A simple example is fermenting chopped weeds with just a small amount of molasses and water in a sealed container. Within days, the mixture becomes sour, stable, and biologically active, rather than, putrid. Fermented plant waste, serves as a wonderful microbial inoculant. Fermented waste does more than just add nutrients. It actually introduces living microbes that continue their work in the soil. When it's buried shallowly or perhaps applied as a diluted liquid, this fermented material feeds the existing soil life and, really helps to expand it. Gardeners often notice quite quickly a faster breakdown of mulch, a much improved soil smell, and a noticeably stronger plant response after using these fermented inputs. This is because during fermentation the material is pre-digested, making it so much easier for the soil organisms to consume. Let's talk about a traditional example, using kitchen scraps. In many older systems, kitchen scraps were never simply composted raw. Instead, things like vegetable peels, rice wash water, and leftover grains were fermented in jars or crocks. Once they'd turned sour, the liquid was diluted and used to water the soil, while the solids were buried in trenches or, say, around perennial plants. This method prevented unpleasant odours, kept pests at bay, and produced a living amendment that integrated very quickly into the soil. Even the smallest gardens benefited, because really nothing was wasted. Now, how does fermentation protect soil from pathogens? Well, fermented materials create acidic environments that suppress harmful microbes. When these are introduced to the soil, the acids are quickly neutralized, but the beneficial microbes remain behind. This gives the good organisms a valuable head start. For example, fermented leaf waste applied around plants often reduces fungal disease pressure simply because beneficial microbes colonize the surfaces first. Disease prevention, in this way, becomes a biological process rather than a chemical one. Turning tough waste into usable soil inputs can be, well, a bit of a challenge. Not all waste composts easily, you know. Woody stems, fibrous weeds and tough leaves tend to break down rather slowly. Fermentation, however, softens these materials by breaking down cell walls and lignin bonds. Fermented comfrey or nettle stems, which were once difficult to compost, become soft and are easily consumed by soil organisms. This makes fermentation especially useful for gardens dealing with large volumes of tough biomass. So, let's talk about how fermented waste behaves differently once it's in the soil. When fermented material enters the soil, decomposition becomes, well, efficient rather than explosive. There's less heat, fewer nutrient losses, and it all just integrates a bit more smoothly. Plants tend to respond in a steady way, instead of that sudden burst of growth followed by a bit of a letdown. The structure of the soil improves too, as microbial byproducts bind those particles together. The end result is soil that holds moisture better, resists compaction, and actually feeds plants over time. Now, why does modern composting so often miss this step? Well, modern composting is really all about speed and volume, isn't it? Fermentation does slow things down just a little at the start, but it actually makes things more effective later on. Since fermentation needs containers, patience and a bit of observation, it was over time set aside in favour of those open piles. The trade-off, really, was convenience instead of efficiency. As a result, gardens became reliant on larger and larger amounts of compost just to get the same benefits. So, how do you reintroduce fermentation into modern gardening? The good news is you don't have to give up your compost piles. What it means is fermenting waste before composting it or applying it directly to the soil in small amounts. You can use sealed containers, barrels, or even just heavy bags. The waste is chopped up, lightly moistened, mixed with a bit of sugar, sealed and left to ferment until it's nice and sour. After that, the material can be buried shallowly, added to compost, or even diluted and used as a soil drench. Living soil, really, it begins before the waste even touches the ground. It's built upstream, so to speak. When waste is fermented first, the soil gets food it can actually use. The microbes arrive ready to get to work, and nutrients stay right where plants can reach them. That forgotten step of fermentation, it turns waste from a bit of a liability into a real biological asset. Gardeners who give this a try often find they need less compost, fewer extra inputs, and a lot less intervention overall. The soil becomes self-supporting rather than dependent. And honestly, that's the shift that transforms waste into living soil. Not by magic, but by understanding how biology really works.